Okay, so I want you to imagine they're separated by less than a year, but if you look at them side by side, they feel like they belong to entirely different scenes.
Worlds apart, really.
Absolutely. Scene 1, it's December 10th, 1994. We're in Oslo, Norway. It's freezing cold outside, but inside, this room is just glowing with this electric, almost surreal atmosphere. You've got the Prime Minister of Israel, Yitzhak Rabin, standing on a stage.
And he is not standing there alone, which is really the key part of this whole image.
Right, exactly. Standing next to him is Shimon Peres, his foreign minister. And then standing right there with him is Yasser Arafat, the leader of the PLO.
A man who, for decades, was basically considered the devil incarnate in Israel, the ultimate enemy.
And they're all there to accept the Nobel Peace Prize. And Rabin, this gruff, chain-smoking general, man who had spent his entire life in a uniform, he steps up to the microphone and he says this phrase that just stopped the world. He says, "Enough of blood and tears, enough."
It was this incredible high watermark of optimism. It really, really felt, for that brief moment, like the end of a 100-year war was actually in sight.
It did. Now snap to scene 2, November 4th, 1995, Tel Aviv. It's a warm autumn night.
Yeah.
And that same man, Yitzhak Rabin, has just finished speaking at a massive peace rally. He's happy. There's footage of him singing. He's walking down the stairs to his car, and then suddenly, pop, pop, pop.
3 shots.
3 shots ring out. But he isn't shot by an enemy soldier. He's shot by a Palestinian militant. He's assassinated by a Jewish law student, one of his own people.
And in that split second, history just takes this sharp, violent turn. The whole trajectory of the Middle East, it just shifts on a dime.
That is the tragedy and the paradox we're really grappling with today. How did a man who spent his life as the ultimate soldier, the architect of Israel's greatest military victory, become the country's most significant martyr for peace?
And the flip side of that question is just as important. Why, when he finally tried to end the conflict, did it cost him his life at the hands of his own side?
It's a massive story. We're looking at a stack of documents here. Documentary transcripts, biographies, a lot of tactical analyses that trace Rabin's life from, his family's roots in the Russian Empire all the way to that fateful night in Tel Aviv.
And what's so compelling when you dig into this material is that this isn't just a biography. It's really the origin story of the modern Middle East.
Yes, can't understand the headlines we see today about Gaza, the West Bank, the political gridlock, without understanding the path Rabin took.
Absolutely not. The region we're looking at right now was so profoundly shaped by the decisions he made, and maybe even more so by the void he left behind.
So let's rewind. Let's go way back. To understand Rabin, I feel like you have to understand where he came from. Because he wasn't just some politician born into a suit and tie. He was a sabra. And that term, it carries so much weight in the source material.
It does. A sabra, for anyone who doesn't know, it refers to a Jewish person born in the Holy Land, specifically in what was then Mandatory Palestine.
So it distinguishes them from the immigrant generation.
Exactly, from the ones who came from Europe. And the metaphor is of a cat prickly and tough on the outside, to survive the harsh desert climate.
But sweet and soft on the inside.
Right. And that describes Rabin perfectly.
Oh, totally. In all the footage, he's prickly, he's direct, he absolutely hates small talk. He is not a charmer.
Not at all. He was known for being socially awkward, blunt, just really shy. But to understand why he was that way, you have to look at his source code.
Father, Nehemiah, he wasn't born with the name Rabin.
No, he was born Nehemiah Rubitos in 1886 in a shtetl in Ukraine, which was part of the Russian Empire's Pale of Settlement.
The Pale of Settlement. We hear that term in history class, but let's just unpack it for a second. What was life actually like there?
It was essentially a massive open-air prison territory. It stretched from Latvia all the way down Ukraine. It was where the Russian Empire legally confined its Jewish population.
They weren't allowed to live in Russia proper, in Moscow or St. Petersburg.
Nope. And life there was incredibly precarious. Nehemiah was born right after this huge wave of pogroms, violent, state-tolerated, anti-Jewish riot had swept through in the early 1800s.
So his father's earliest memories are of being hunted, essentially, or at the very least, living in this constant state of fear that your neighbor could turn on you at any moment.
Exactly. This violence is what triggered the first Aliyah, which was the first major wave of Zionist migration to Palestine. Nehemiah, he eventually escaped. He first went to the United States as a young man.
Okay.
And here's a little piece of trivia for you. That's where he changed his name from Rubitos to Rabin. It comes from the Hebrew word for rabbi.
Which is funny because he wasn't religious at all, was he?
That's the irony. He was the opposite. He was a socialist revolutionary. He joined a group called Pole Zion.
Workers of Zion, right?
Yes. And this is fascinating because it was this fusion of two huge ideas, Marxism and Zionism.
Yep.
At the time, there was this massive debate in the Jewish world. You had the Jewish Labor Bund in Russia, which was socialist but anti-Zionist. They wanted to improve life in Europe.
Oh.
Pole Zion said, no, we need a national home and it needs to be a socialist workers' paradise. This is the intellectual soup Nehemiah is.
And he meets Rabin's mother, Rosa. later on.
Yes. Rosa Cohen, she was from Belarus, also in the Russian Empire. She was known as Red Rosa because of her fierce socialist activism. She was a powerhouse, incredibly intense, very, very ideological.
So not a warm and fuzzy household, I'm guessing?
Not at all. They actually met in Jerusalem after World War I. Nehemiah had come over with the Jewish Legion to fight the Ottomans alongside the British. They married in 1921, and Yitzhak was born in Jerusalem in 1922.
So Yitzhak Rabin is born in Jerusalem. He's the first native-born generation, and he's born into a house that is basically a revolutionary headquarters.
Precisely. He grew up mostly in Tel Aviv. He went to an agricultural school his mother helped found. But then tragedy struck early. His mother, Rosa, died when he was just a teenager, around 19.
That's heartbreaking. And that happened right as the whole political situation was just exploding, right?
Yes. This was during the Arab Revolt of 1936 to 1939. The local Arab population in Mandatory Palestine rose up against British rule and against the massive influx of Jewish immigrants. It was a violent, chaotic, brutal time.
And this is where the soldier part of Rabin's identity really began.
It is. At age 16, he joins the Haganah,
which was the main paramilitary defense force for the Jewish.
Correct. It was the precursor to the IDF, the Israel Defense Forces. But here's one of those sliding doors moments in history that the source really highlights. Rabin was obviously a brilliant kid. In the early 1940s, he had actually been offered a full scholarship to study hydraulic engineering at UC Berkeley in California.
No way. So you're telling me in another timeline, Yitzhak Rabin is just a retired engineer living in San Francisco, maybe cheering for the 49ers?
It's entirely possible. He had the ticket out. He could have sat out the entire war in sunny California.
But he turned it down.
He turned it down. He fell under the influence of a man named Yigal Allon, a legendary commander. And Allon basically convinced him that his people needed him more than he needed a degree. Rabin chose the sword over the slide rule.
And he didn't just join the rank and file, he joined the elite unit, the Palmach.
The Palmach was the elite strike force of the Haganah, the absolute tip of the spear. And his service there during World War II gets really, really complicated. Mm-hmm. We often think of WWII as being so clear-cut, allies versus Axis. But for a Jewish fighter in British Palestine, it was incredibly messy.
Because the British were the colonial power they wanted to eventually kick out, right? But the British were also the ones fighting the Nazis.
Exactly. The enemy of my enemy is, well, it's still kind of my enemy. David Ben-Gurion famously said, "We will fight the war as if there is no white." That was the British policy restricting Jewish immigration. And we will fight the white paper as if there is no war.
So you have to hold two contradictory ideas in your head at once.
Completely. So initially, Rabin fights alongside the British. He participated in the Syria-Lebanon campaign against the Vichy French forces who were collaborating with the Nazis.
So at that point, he's technically an ally of the British Empire.
For a moment. But as soon as it became clear the Nazis were going to lose, enemy shift, the Jewish leadership knew the British weren't going to just hand over a state. So Rabin and the Palmach begin preparing to fight the British.
And he gets his hands dirty pretty quickly. The source mentions a raid on a prisoner camp.
The Atlit detainee camp. In 1945. This was an incredibly daring operation. The British were holding Jewish immigrants, many of them Holocaust survivors, who had tried to enter the country illegally.
Wow.
And Rabin led a force that broke in and freed over 200 of them. It was a direct public challenge to the authority of the British Empire.
Which eventually got him arrested.
It did. In 1946, during Black Sabbath, which was this massive British crackdown on the entire Jewish resistance movement, Rabin and his father were both arrested. Rabin spent 5 months in a British prison.
It's just wild to think of a future prime minister sitting in a British prison cell. But things move so fast. By 1947, the UN votes to partition the land. The British announce they're leaving in 48. Ben-Gurion declares independence, and then suddenly, it's all-out war.
The 1948 War of Independence, and this is where Rabin goes from being a militia fighter to a true military commander. He commanded the Herald Brigade, which was tasked with one of the most critical missions of the war, securing the road to Jerusalem.
The Bab el-Wad.
Exactly. It was brutal convoy warfare. If that road closed, the 100,000 Jews in Jerusalem would have been starved out.
There's a specific incident mentioned in the source material about this war that really caught my attention. It's about the internal conflict. Even while they're fighting 5 invading Arab armies, the Jewish groups are also fighting each other.
This is a critical moment in Israeli history, and definitely in Rabin's development. You had different militias, like the right-wing Irgun, and Ben-Gurion, the new leader of the new state, he said, no, we cannot have private armies. We need one unified Israel Defense Force.
Okay.
And this led to the Al-Talina affair.
The Al-Talina was a ship, right? It was bringing weapons.
Yes, a ship bringing a huge cache of arms for the Irgun. Ben-Gurion ordered the IDF to fire on it because the Irgun refused to hand over the weapons to the National Army. And Rabin was there commanding the troops on the beach in Tel Aviv. He had to give the order to fire on fellow Jews to enforce the authority of the state.
That sets a precedent for him, doesn't it? He puts the state, the institution, above ideology, or at least above factionalism.
It shows his absolute commitment to structure, to the chain of command. He learned a very harsh lesson at 26 years old. A state cannot survive if it has competing armed. By the end of the 1948 war, Rabin is a career soldier. He decides to stay.
And the next phase of his life is all about building that army into a professional machine.
Totally. He heads the training of battalion commanders, instilling what they call the Pomok ethos into the National Army. He goes to British Staff College, cleans up his English, which is crucial for his later diplomacy.
And he rises through the ranks incredibly fast. He's a major general in his 30s, and by 1964, he's the chief of staff, the top dog.
And just in time, too, because the drums of war are beating again. We're approaching 1967, the Six-Day War.
This is arguably the most famous war in modern Middle Eastern history. Israel versus Egypt, Syria, Jordan. But the source drops this bombshell about Rabin right before the war started. It says he had a nervous break.
It does. And this is a detail that was hushed up for a very long time. In the weeks leading up to the war, about 2 weeks before, the pressure was just unimaginable.
Yeah.
Nasser in Egypt was blockading the Straits of Tiran, which was an act of war. The Arab states were mobilizing on all borders. The rhetoric coming out of Cairo and Damascus was about driving the Jews into the...
So Israel felt like it was facing a second Holocaust.
Genuinely. They were digging mass graves in Tel Aviv parks. And Rabin is the one man responsible for stopping it.
That's an unbelievable amount of pressure.
And he was a heavy smoker. He wasn't sleeping. He was barely eating. He was diagnosed with nicotine poisoning, but really he collapsed from anxiety and exhaustion. He was out of commission for about 24 to 36 hours.
That makes him sound so human. We always see these generals portrayed as if they're made of stone, but he cracked under the pressure.
He did, but, and this is the key, he came back, he recovered, he took charge again, and the war plan that he had helped oversee was executed, well, flawlessly.
Flawless is almost an understatement. In just 6 days, they captured the West Bank from Jordan, Gaza, and the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt, and the Golan Heights from Syria. They take East Jerusalem. The entire map of the Middle East changes overnight.
And Rabin becomes a legend, the architect of victory. The breakdown was forgotten, swept under the rug. He leaves the military in 1968 as a national hero.
But here's where it gets interesting. He doesn't go straight into politics, into the Knesset. He goes to Washington.
Right, he becomes the ambassador to the U.S., which, looking back, was a huge... Before this, Israel's main international ally was actually France.
Oh, right. The French had supplied the Mirage jets.
And helped with Israel's. But after 1967, Charles de Gaulle pulled back. Rabin realized the future lay with the United States. So he spent 5 years in D.C. working with Nixon and Kissinger, securing advanced weapons like the Phantom jets for the IDF.
But he also developed a new philosophy during. The source calls it the bargaining chip doc.
This is really the seed of the peace process that will see decades. Rabin looked at all this new territory Israel conquered in 1967, the West Bank, Sinai, Gaza, Golan, and unlike the religious right, he didn't see it as some messianic redemption or holy land that could never, ever be given up.
He saw it as real estate.
Valuable real estate, exactly. Valuable real estate that could be traded. Land for peace. He was willing to give the land back if the Arab neighbors would recognize Israel's right to exist and provide real security.
So he's a pragmatist, not an idealist.
Through and through. So he comes back from Washington in 1970. He actually misses being in command during the Yom Kippur War, which is lucky for him politically because that war was a disaster for the leadership.
Right. Golda Meir eventually resigned because of the fallout, and suddenly there's this vacuum at the top of the Labor Party.
A vacuum that Rabin, the war hero who wasn't tainted by the failure of 1973, was perfectly positioned to fill. He ascends to the prime ministership in
his first term. He's the first native-born prime minister, the first Sabra. That must have felt like a real generational passing of the torch.
It was, but it was a really rocky term. He had to deal with stagflation. Inflation hit 100% at one point. It was a mess.
Oh.
But he did achieve some really big things. The Entebbe raid happened on...
Oh, right. The incredible rescue of the hostages in Uganda.
Yes. In 1976, Palestinian and German hijackers took an Air France plane. Rabin gave the final green light for the rescue operation. Daring, tragically, the commander of the unit, Yonatan Netanyahu.
Benjamin Netanyahu's older brother.
His older brother, yeah. He was the only Israeli soldier killed in the raid.
It's so strange how these same names just keep weaving in and out of the story. Netanyahu, Rabin, Perez... They're all there in the mix constantly.
They are. Rabin also signed the Sinai Interim Agreement with Egypt in 1975, which was really the first concrete step toward the peace treaty that Menachem Begin would sign a few years later.
Yeah.
But Rabin's first term didn't end with a parade. It ended with a bank account.
The Dollar account affair. This story is wild because it sounds so quaint by modern standards of political scandal. Break it down for us.
Chuckles. It really does. So back then, there were these super strict currency controls in Israel.
Yeah.
It was illegal for citizens to hold foreign bank accounts. You had to keep your money in Israeli shekels.
Okay.
Well, a journalist discovered that Rabin's wife, Leah, still had a U.S. bank account from their time in Washington. He was ambassador.
And how much money are we talking about? Million.
Not even close. Depending on the source, it was something like $2,000, maybe up to $10,000. It wasn't a fortune.
That's it. That's the scandal.
That was it. But Rabin was this man of strict, almost rigid integrity. He could have tried to blame his wife or claim it was an oversight or fight it in court. Instead, he took full responsibility. He resigned as party leader to protect his...
Wow. Actual accountability. That feels refreshing.
It is. But his resignation had a huge consequence. It opened the door wide open for the opposition.
A massive consequence.
Yes. In 1977, for the first time in Israel's 30-year history, the Labor Party lost a national election. Menachem began, and the right-wing Likud party came to power. It was an absolute earthquake in Israeli politics.
So Rabin goes into the political wilderness. For years, he's just sitting in the Knesset, writing his memoirs, watching from the sideline.
For a while, yes. He watched as Begin made peace with Egypt at Camp David, ironically finishing the work that Rabin himself had started. He watched Israel get bogged down in the Lebanon War in 1982. But you can't keep a man like Rabin down forever.
Right.
In 1984, we get a national unity government, a power-sharing deal between Labor and Likud, and Rabin comes back. He returns as Minister of Defense.
And this brings us to the late 80s, the first Intifada. This really seems like the major turning point for Rabin's entire worldview.
Absolutely. The first Intifada started in December 1987, and it wasn't a conventional war. It wasn't against tanks and jets. It was a grassroots Palestinian uprising in Gaza and the West Bank.
We're talking stones, Molotov cocktails, strikes, civil disobedience.
Yes. And initially, Rabin tried to crush it with force. He was the defense minister. He had this iron fist policy. He famously or infamously was quoted as saying they should break their bones.
So he believed that if you just hit them hard enough, the uprising would stop. He was deploying the army to do police.
He was, but... and this is the mark of his intellect and his pragmatism. He looked at the situation on the ground and he realized it just wasn't working. He saw that you cannot defeat an entire population that wants to be free using only military. Can't shoot an idea. He understood that this wasn't fundamentally a military problem.
So the soldier realizes the gun has reached its limit.